When we're building in CDK, we hope that there are really good level 2 and level 3 constructs for the thing that we're trying to achieve, whether that thing is a single piece of infrastructure, like an S3 bucket, or whether it's a more complicated pattern of several things being combined. Unfortunately, that doesn't always turn out to be the case, and so sometimes we have to fall back to level 1 constructs, and that means that we're dealing with the raw CloudFormation. There's no real developer experience, no abstractions, but that's perfectly fine for the vast majority of infrastructure. It's just a little bit trickier, or a little bit more verbose. There are some resources, however, where making them in CDK can be really, really challenging, and often that's because there's no underlying CloudFormation support. So let's cover one example that I recently went through with a customer where they were setting up a VPN connection. You can see that the VPN connection resource in CloudFormation has a VPN tunnel options specification, and in there we have a pre-shared key and a tunnel inside CIDR. So that's a couple of options, but if we look at the options available, for example, if we use the CLI, we would see we have a ton of other bits and pieces that we might want to have on. Loads of encryption settings, loads of other settings to do with the logistics of creating the tunnel, and really importantly, as this customer found, with logging. So it's quite challenging when you have this kind of situation. You think, well, I can't make this in CloudFormation. You might think, okay, well, I can't make it in CloudFormation. I could do a custom resource, and you'd be absolutely right. But I think at that point, you have to trade it off. Is it worth you creating, updating, and testing your custom resource over time, especially for something complicated and highly critical like a VPN connection? Or should you look at another alternative? And in some cases, an alternative could just be creating one with the CLI and maybe documenting the commands you used. Or you could create it in the console and document the steps that you went through. And okay, we're using a tool like CDK because we're trying to avoid this, right? We're trying to avoid manually creating infrastructure, because in a DR scenario, or when we create other environments, we have to make everything by hand if we don't use an infrastructure as code tool like CDK. But there are some cases where it's just more practical to do something like a little shell script with the CLI, or a nice little visual guide for creating the console, especially when it's something like a VPN connection resource that only maybe changes once a year or once every 6 months. I think you have to trade off the development time of producing and maintaining a construct versus the time you actually are going to spend doing this by hand. So it's just something to bear in mind when you're dealing with something that doesn't have a CloudFormation resource or doesn't have good support. Consider making a custom resource, have a bit of a think about whether that's a good use of time to make and maintain that and how important it is, how often you're creating this resource, for example. And then maybe consider that you could use a bit of an escape hatch, for lack of a better phrase, and just make it by hand or with a script. The other thing I will point out again while we are on this topic is the CloudFormation coverage roadmap is really handy if you want to see where things are at with the resource or properties that you're interested in. So let's look for VPN connection, which is the resource we were just looking at in the console. And you can see that there are some issues with people wanting the functionality that has been requested, or sorry, that's been made part of the CLI.